Welcome to our webinar. This is a webinar on the newest book in the Mandel Brandeis series in Jewish education, Teaching Israel Studies of Pedagogy from the Field. I'm Sharon Feiman-Nemser, semi-retired professor of Jewish education at Brandeis and co-editor of this series with Brandeis University Press, with my colleagues John Levison and Jonathan Krasner. And I'm here with the editors and authors of this really wonderful and important new book, Sivan Zakai and Matt Reingold, and with two terrific thought partners, Lisa Grant and Alex Pomson, for what we hope will be a lively and informative conversation about a book that you'll then want to immediately order for yourself and recommend to all of your colleagues. So I want to start by briefly introducing the people who will be sharing the conversation with me, and then we'll dive in with some questions about the book itself. Sivan Zakai is the Sara Lee Professor of Jewish Education at HUC-JIR in Los Angeles. She is a thought leader in Jewish education and Israel education, directing the Children Learning About Israel project, and author of the award-winning book, My Second Favorite Country, How American Jewish Children Think About Israel. Her co-editor and also an author in this book is Matt Reingold, who teaches and serves as the co-head of Jewish History of the Jewish History Department at Tannenbaum Chat Day School in Toronto, Canada. His research interests focus on graphic novels and Israel education, and he's the author of 4 books about Jewish and Israeli comics, including Gender and Sexuality in Israeli graphic novels. Rabbi Lisa Grant directs the rabbinical program at HUC-JIR in New York. Her research interests focus on adult Jewish learning and the place of Israel in American Jewish life, and she's published widely on these topics. And Alex Pomson is the principal and managing director of Rosov Consulting Israel. He's internationally known for research on the life course of Jewish families, teachers' lives and work, and Israel education. He also has written widely about these topics, and he is the co-author with Jack Wertheimer of the first book in the Mandel Brandeis series in Jewish education, Inside Jewish Day Schools, Leadership, Learning, and Community, another must-read book. So this book is clearly about a topic that is front of mind for many, many educators, given the current political situation. Even though it was written before October 7th, it has much to say to educators and Jewish educators and Israel educators about the challenges and choices for anyone who is teaching about Israel. And I'll start with some questions, but I hope that we'll end up generating a conversation among us as we proceed together. I also want to invite people in the audience to share your own questions in the Q&A, and we'll save some time at the end of our conversation to address your very questions. So please, as issues and questions come to mind, send them to us as well. So let's start with some basics. Sivan, in your opening chapter in this book, you spend some time unpacking the title, unpacking teaching and Israel and the phrase teaching Israel. Can you tell us why what's the message that you're trying to convey by doing that kind of work, and why is that so important?
First of all, I want to thank you, Sharon, for facilitating this conversation, and I want to thank the Mandel Center for hosting it, and to Lisa and Alex, thank you so much for joining us, and hello to all of you who are here with us on this call today. We start in this book with a premise that teaching is really hard work, and at least in the present day, teaching Israel is extremely hard work. I mean, perhaps the hardest. And in unpacking that, in kind of laying out how we chose the title for this book, Teaching Israel, we're trying to convey a whole bunch of messages. First of all, this book is rooted in a shared conception of teaching. and in the difficulty of the work of teaching. We draw upon philosopher Israel Scheffler's definition of teaching, which is that teaching is, and I quote, actively aimed at the achievement of learning and practiced in such a manner as to respect the student's intellectual integrity and capacity for independent judgment. And you'll see that all of the chapters in this book really focus on this kind of conception of teaching, rooting it in student learning. And that means that we have a really broad understanding of who counts as a teacher. Sharon, as a university professor, is a teacher. Matt, as a high school teacher, is a teacher. I, as a parent, am a teacher. And there are all sorts of other contexts in which people function as teachers. The idea of Israel, though, is much more contested, and the authors in this volume do not actually share a conception of what we mean when we say the word Israel. Israel is an interdisciplinary subject, both Israel education and Israel studies. And also, Israel has meant different things to different people. So many people think Israel just means the modern nation state or the Netanyahu government. Certainly it can mean that. But Israel can also be a symbolic place in the hearts and minds of Jewish communities over time. It can also be an understanding of the multiple communities and cultures that make up a diverse Israeli society, and many, many more. And actually, the authors in this study, as they reflect on their own teaching or the teachers that they study, frame which Israel and why Israel in radically different ways. But by uniting these two words, teaching and Israel, to highlight teaching Israel, we're actually making a slightly different claim, because anyone who is familiar with the literature on the history of teaching and learning about Israel in North America knows that in several decades ago, the term teaching Israel was used as a kind of predecessor term to the more common language now of Israel education. And Israel education connotes a shift away from an understanding that it's just Israel at the heart of teaching and learning in Israel education, and that there's kind of a much broader conception of the work involved in Israel education. But we actually wanted to resuscitate this term, teaching Israel, in order to situate teaching as the analog to learning about Israel, because much of the existing literature in both Jewish education and Jewish studies that focuses on Israel focuses on the learning, how it is that people learn about Israel, the context in which they learn about Israel, and the kind of construction of Israel that people do as they learn. And we think that is crucially important work, and also that it obscures all of the pedagogical choices that teachers make to do the very difficult work of helping that learning happen. And so in using the phrase teaching Israel, we want to bring new life to this old term to say learning about Israel is important, and so is teaching about Israel.
Great, that's very helpful. Matt, now can you help us understand the subtitle, which got added in order to help communicate what this book is trying to do? Tell us what studies of pedagogy from the field is that subtitle serving here, both the pedagogy part and the field part.
So echoing Sivan, I want to thank Sharon for facilitating this conversation, and Alex and Lisa for joining, and really the Mandel Center for hosting this event. Very excited to be joining today. Sharon, you're right. The subtitle was added out of a desire to really emphasize for readers how we are thinking about the field and pedagogy in new and expansive ways. That Sivan alluded to before, that there are different kinds of teachers. And she referenced me and Sharon and herself in these roles of classroom educator, university educator, and parent. We are taking, by considering studies of pedagogy, we are exploring the idea that teaching happens from a lot of different types of people, and it occurs in a lot of different types of settings. And while it's true that within the volume, readers will see that there are some chapters set in the university classroom and some that are in more traditional day school, elementary school classrooms, high school classrooms, we actually think that it's more than just that binary two ways of thinking about where they are happening. Because we do include classes at the university, but it's not just one type of university. We include city colleges, we include a Canadian university, and we also have a chapter about learning about Israel at a United States military college. We do have chapters about how students in Jewish day schools learn, but those are very different settings. We have early childhood education settings, we have elementary schools, we have high schools. We also have gap year programs in Israel. We have adult education classes from an Israel educator with the learners mostly living in North America. We really are exploring the idea that the learning of Israel is done in many different settings by educators in different spaces, sometimes not even in the same physical space as their learners. What we also wanted to explore is the idea that who the educators are is also not monolithic. That we featured articles by practitioners, people who have never done scholarly research before, and people who have been studying education and writing about education in a formal capacity for many years. But we also have people who are conducting reflective practices and writing chapters about their experiences and how they are able to study what goes on in their own classrooms in order to better their own teaching and to shed light on what happens in those spaces for others. And I think that's especially evident in Robin Harper's opening chapter, where she shares vignettes from her teaching diary and then goes on to use those to draw bigger conclusions about teaching Israel in a city of New York college system, teaching mostly non-Jewish students about Israel. And there's a moment in her chapter that really stands out where someone questions, well, why would you want to be teaching about this to non-Jews or something along those lines? And she's like, Israel is just a fascinating place to be learning about. And on one hand, we have these chapters that focus on that Israel is just interesting for students. And that's something that I think is also echoed in Amin Tarzi's article about US military colleges. And then we also have chapters where for the authors and the educators whose pedagogical moves they're studying, Israel is not just an interesting place, Israel is an essential, important core part of identity. And so when we are also talking about studies of pedagogy, we are also considering the different approaches and identities that the teachers are bringing in relation to the learners who are in their classrooms, and together how they create something new through the moves that the educators make.
Great. So the book is really expanding both the places where Israel is being taught and the people who can generate knowledge about the teaching of Israel. I think that's also important to highlight. Both Alex and Lisa are deeply familiar with the scholarship on the history of teaching about Israel and of the teaching and learning of Israel over time, and themselves have made contributions to that literature. So maybe we can start by each of you saying something about what you see as sort of the unique contribution of this new book in that broader context of research on teaching Israel. Lisa, would you maybe start?
Sure, happy to. Also want to add my
Glad
thanks.
you're here.
Yeah, thanks. Add my thanks to Sharon and to Sivan and Matt and to the Mandel Center and to Alex. All of us, really to be in this conversation is such a delight. Really, really very special. So I feel honored and happy to be here. So I would say that, this book is exemplary in so many ways and really has, I hope, in and of itself has so much to offer. And I hope it also will invite us to explore a new chapter in the research about teaching Israel and Israel education. And I wanted to highlight a couple of distinctions. For many decades, we've been focusing on teaching more about Israel, or the purposes of teaching Israel, and much less and the varied purposes, and often that spills over into some kind of judgment about what's happening right and what's happening wrong, or what should be done, and it blurs into questions about when is it education and when is it advocacy. And this book confronts that, that confronts it in a very powerful way, I think, in that it's really not focused on the purposes as much as the actual practice. And I want to highlight two things that have already been mentioned, that Sivan talked, quoting Scheffler, this starting premise of respecting the learner's integrity and doing research that's, and exploring this experience of learning from the student's perspective, and rooted really in the student's learning. And that, I think, the section on using students' voices was very powerful for me. That really, how often in research do we hear deep exploration of students' voices? More often we're getting anecdotes and short quips, to sort of prove the point. But this was really opening up dilemmas that students were working through. In particular, the Matt's chapter that he wrote with two former students, complex texts and complex identities, and how when students are confronted with knowledge and information that is so deeply challenging to their preconceptions of, and how does Matt, as a teacher, create space for them to voice those challenges, and create an environment where they feel safe to voice those challenges, and then feel supported in their learning. And that level of nuance and sophistication and thoughtfulness about how you engage with learners when they are in this critical moment of really confronting something that is so very dissonant from what they thought they knew. I think that that's a really profound element of the book that we see in many different places. And sometimes we see it from the teachers themselves. So in the Feiman chapter on barriers to educators' reticence for engaging with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we see it more from the teacher's perspective, whereas they acknowledge that they should be teaching about the conflict, but they feel so uncomfortable and unprepared to teach about the conflict. So I think the courage and the honesty within this book is really, really exciting and profound. And what Matt said earlier, just the range and variety of approaches that are explored in the book is another incredibly wonderful contribution, that it really opens up our thinking and changes, I think, and challenges our understanding of what does it mean to teach Israel, and how we look across this vast tapestry of approaches and explore the dilemmas within it is very rich. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about how we might want to use that, but I think that those are the two aspects that I found particularly exciting about this book.
Thanks. Yeah, I just before Alex, we ask you the same question. I think if we start with Scheffler's notion of teaching as a practice that honors the integrity of students to reason for themselves, then this book really highlights the kind of teaching that makes that kind of work on the part of learners possible. Alex, what do you see as a unique contribution to the broader scholarship on teaching and learning Israel?
Well, first of all, like everybody else, I want to express gratitude for this opportunity and for coming together with fellow travelers who have been plowing this field for quite a while. And this certainly is a landmark occasion. The publication of this book is really very special. And so when you ask about what's unique about the book, there are many things that one could say. I'm going to focus particularly on one that Matt has already started to talk about, and that is really about the very special juxtaposition of studies of Israel education and studies of Israel studies in the same volume. In the introduction, Sivan defines Israel studies as academic scholarship and teaching about Israel, and she defines Israel education as, quote, attempts to build a connection to Israel as part of a larger sense of contemporary Jewish life, close quote. And I personally found it incredibly generative to read inquiries into the teaching of Israel studies along those of Israel education. And as Matt has already mentioned, for example, there's Robin Harper's self-study of teaching Israel studies in an inner city college, and there's Armin Tazi's reflections, I should say, on teaching in a military college at the Marine Corps University. Who knew that Israel studies was on the curriculum there? And those chapters are sitting cheek by cheek with studies of Israel education in day schools, in Israel experience programs, synagogue schools, adult education settings, etc. And I really think that this juxtaposition constitutes a healthy challenge to those of us who are intently focused on the field of Israel education. What sprang to mind for me was a metaphor I often turn to, but it seems particularly relevant here, a metaphor of windows and mirrors, in that I think with Israel studies, we kind of teach our students to look through the window at something other than themselves, that's not inside the house, it's something different. And as Matt already mentioned, Robin Harper quotes the Israeli political scientist Asher Arian, where he says, Israel's a state, like any state, it's just the case. Now, for someone in the field of Israel education, that's kind of shocking and refreshing. Just a case, right? With Israel education, however, like, we encourage our students to look carefully in the mirror, right? And no one more so than Barry Chazan in his influential formulation of a relational approach to Israel education, which Laura Novick Weiner in her chapter explores, and Chazan puts it like this: it's the first principle in that approach to Israel education is that the individual, not Israel, is in the center, right? And this is something that Kopelowitz and Pitkowski also look at in their chapter. It's the idea that Israel education focuses on the Jewish self and the formation of the individual's Jewish identity. When you think about that concept alongside the way of thinking about Israel studies, the mirror alongside the window, it really highlights a danger in the field of Israel education, a danger of self-absorption. Solipsism is like we pay too much attention to ourselves. And I think one of the insights I took from the book is how our students would benefit if we would encourage them to shift their gaze from the mirror to the window, and for us as Israel educators to spend more time looking through that window at Israel as a case, something a little bit more objectively, and become more familiar with Israel as something that isn't just about ourselves.
Anybody want to comment on either of these observations before we move on? I'm glad that you highlighted this juxtaposition of Matt. Yes?
Yeah, picking up on something that Lisa said, I think that another way that the book also brings together these different sites, different educators, is also different research methodologies. And that too highlights the different ways that we can study teaching of Israel. And so, for example, whether it's Jonathan Golden and Yoni Cadden's practitioner study of their own classroom and their own program in Boston, and how they were able to modify their learning and teaching program, or Diane Tickton-Schuster's study of herself as a learner in a classroom with the Israeli educator Rachel Korazim, and how Rachel brings literature to life. There's different research methodologies that are in the book, and also different topics about Israel are brought into the book, which also highlights the different types of curricula and the different content about Israel that is also taught. And I think that those are really important pieces to the story also.
Yes, and that's important too. I'm thinking about the audience for the book. I mean, you've helped highlight the range of authors, contexts, methodologies of exploration and inquiry. But I'm thinking now about who should read this book, for whom is this book written, and what they could get from reading the book. And one way, if people see the title Teaching Israel, they may be expecting a how-to book, a book that's advocating best practices in the field of teaching Israel. And that's not at all the kind of book that we have here. And yet there's a way in which, and I think, Alex, you said this when we had an initial conversation to plan our conversation, that this book has a lot to say to the field of practice, to this diverse field of practitioners who are teachers of Israel across these multiple settings. So even though it's not a how-to book and it's not advocating best practices, it has a lot to say to teachers of Israel. And I think it would be helpful to kind of lift up and make a little bit more visible how different audiences could learn, what they could learn from this book, and the ways in which it could really inform practice. Somebody who wants to start? I was making for myself a list of examples, and I was thinking about the idea, who said there's nothing as practical as a good theory. There are a number of chapters that, for me, put on the table an idea or a framework or a typology, a ways of thinking about my curriculum, the choices I make about what's important to teach, or how to think about where my learners are coming from, that I think makes this an extremely valuable book. For example, Yoni Cadden and Jonathan Golden talk about, as Matt mentioned, the framework for a new course in a pluralistic day high school, a framework for developing a new Israel curriculum that highlights the elements of knowledge, connection, and stance, and what it means to design a curriculum that helps students have the capacity and the confidence to create their own stances on various issues related to Israel. And I was thinking that could be such a useful lens for a group of teachers in a school or a camp or a setting where teaching Israel is an important enterprise, to think about where does our curriculum map? How does our curriculum map onto this curriculum framework? Or similarly, a different framework that comes from Laura Wiener's typology for conceptualizing the idea of connections to Israel. She's studying the teaching of Israel in supplementary schools, in religious schools, and she identifies and conceptualizes different ways that learners and teachers as well understand and enact their connection to Israel. We often say the goal of Israel education is to build connections between learners and Israel. But what exactly does that mean? What forms could that take? I think that's another example of a kind of a theory or framework that a group of teachers, a group of could use as a way of mapping their own relationship to the topic and their purposes for teaching their students. So one of the ways that I think this book is extremely practical is that it offers a range of ideas for thinking about our goals, the emphases in our curriculum, where our learners are coming from, and where our teachers are coming from. Sort of different conceptual frameworks for those kinds of conversations and investigations. But I'm interested in other thoughts that you have about what this book has to offer to different components of a wide audience for whom it was written.
I'll just chime in here. Thank you, Sharon, for naming all of those ways that this can be practical. And I will say that for me, the most profound part of reading the contributions of my fellow co-contributors to this book was really the very careful way that different authors named the kinds of questions and dilemmas that teachers have to contend with as they do their work. And across settings, there's a shared set of questions about what kinds of decisions need to be made in the planning and what kinds of decisions need to be made in the unanticipated challenging moments of the conversation that takes an unexpected turn, and the kinds of questions that teachers have to make about balancing the needs of different learners in a room full of learners. And in each chapter, people have named explicitly what those challenges, what those dilemmas, and what the questions of that teachers have to contend with. And the authors in this volume don't actually think in similar ways about how to address those, but they certainly model for all of us who care about teaching as a professional, deep practice what it means to name the kinds of questions that teachers have to deeply, deeply consider as they make choices about what to teach and how to plan for teaching and how to assess their own teaching, etc.
I'm happy to offer. Oh, Matt, please go ahead. No, I was going to pay you a compliment anyway. In terms of how to, as you say, Sharon, this isn't how to, but there's so much detail here. There's so many really strong examples of how to do the work well. And one of the most outstanding is Matt's co-authored chapter with Alexa Jacoby, Benjamin Day, former students of his. The co-authorship of the chapter exemplifies Matt's teaching as and the way in which he models the teacher as a co-explorer of tough questions about Israel. And you seem to come afresh to those questions each year in the way that the chapter is written. And so you're kind of prompting students to become a lot smarter about significant moments in Israel's history, while confronting challenging questions about who they are and about their relationship to Israel, which for me really kind of exemplifies the skillful use of both the mirror and the window that I mentioned before. And that really, it's a proof text of how one might teach as an explorer and as a co-explorer with one's students. There are many more examples I can offer, but I want to let my colleagues jump into.
Matt, you were going to add to this.
I'd like to call out two things that I learned. I fully, certainly when Sivan and I were putting together the book, there was a clear interest in not producing a how to teach. There are no lesson plans. There's no how to go about structuring a classroom or things like that. But at the same time, as many people have already acknowledged, there are nuggets that can be extracted from the chapters about what are different practices that can be brought into the teaching of Israel. And one of the ones that, or two that really stuck out to me, the first is from Joshua Layden's chapter. Joshua wrote about in his chapter about source sheets and the challenges of teaching college-age students and sometimes being asked to produce the source sheet before the class. And what his chapter calls attention to is the ways that texts are, yes, texts can be political texts, but they don't necessarily need to be positive or neutral texts, at least until we know what the educator is doing with the text. And in my own practice, that's something that I've been exploring a lot. I regularly make use of political cartoons in my teaching, and people question, well, how are you going to use that text? And my answer is that's a great question, because they're asking me, well, what is the purpose of the inclusion of it? Whereas others say, I can't believe you're including that text. It's so fill in the blank, right wing, left wing, critical of secular people, critical of Orthodox people. And my answer to those people are, but you don't know how the text is going to be used yet. And so why don't you wait to find out what the purpose is before you are censoring the text? And in the end, they still might not necessarily like how I'm using it. But to reject a text entirely just because the text itself is deemed as offensive or troubling without knowing what the moves that the educator is going to be making, I find very, very troubling. And so I appreciated the way that Joshua framed that in his chapter. The second is Mira Sucharov's chapter about her college university classes she's in Ottawa, and her willingness to bring herself into her learning and the ways in which educators can share of themselves, but also not make their own personal politics the center of the class. And that she models how by bringing herself in, that creates a space then for the learners to feel comfortable bringing themselves into the classroom. And for me, that was something that was very transformative as someone who really is hesitant to share my own politics because I was nervous that that would take over the space. Mira modeled a way in which, by sharing of herself, it facilitates greater comfort for others to share of themselves. And that was something that was very helpful in getting me to think about what is my positionality in the classroom and how do I want to be transparent in my classroom.
Yeah, I think that issue, her chapter is called Activism and Identity, and she's trying to figure out where her own activism plays a role in her teaching of BDS, which I thought, Sivan, one of those enduring choices or dilemmas that all teachers of a subject like Israel have to think about is that question of how much of myself do I reveal? Where do my own, and how do my personal beliefs and my own relationship to Israel play out in my teaching? That, I think that's one of the interesting and big cross-cutting themes in this book, all the way from the very neutral stance that our colleague in the military academy can afford to take in the teaching of Israel, to chapters where teachers are really grappling. Mira herself is a social activist. So does she come down on the side of social justice or on introducing students in a more neutral way to an array of positions on these contentious issues? So
yeah, and I also want to hold up Laura Novak Weiner's chapter because in one chapter, she actually maps out a spectrum of different positions that teachers take about framing their own selves and their own personal narratives, their own beliefs, politics, and opinions in the classroom. And she has just a really beautiful way of mapping out the different ways that teachers think about that very question.
Yeah, I think that's another example of one of those useful conceptual frameworks that can be a stimulus for conversation among teachers in helping them clarify their goals and position. That makes me think, Lisa, of an issue that you raised in our prior conversation that I think we should also put on the table, which is the ways in which the book itself could be a resource in professional learning and professional development for teachers. And that was something that you highlighted. Do you want to say a little bit about how you see that playing out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways that the book can be used, which makes it, really, it could be worthy of a year or more of study. Excuse me. I mean, I think we've already touched on some of those already. I mean, Sharon, you mentioned, sort of identifying the theories that are threaded throughout is one organizing frame. Particular questions, I think, is another. There's many examples of different ways in which students and teachers engage in critical inquiry, and how does that play out in the classroom? What I mentioned earlier, how does it play out, particularly when students confront an idea that is so very different from something that they learned prior to this. The final section about when teachers learn, I think, could be a really rich way in which educators could get together and talk about their, and really share with one another where they stand, the ability, I think many Israel educators, not the ones represented in this book who are maybe the cream of the crop, but there are many Israel educators who are very anxious about teaching Israel, and are very anxious. Matt shared this already. He himself, about sharing their own opinions or sharing, that being reluctant to bring themselves too much into it. But we know that we teach who we are, that is a part of who we are. And so the more open and honest we can be with ourselves about that and with each other, and our students, our colleagues and our students, I think that makes us better teachers. And this book has so many examples where you can really dive into those experiences as they're described on the pages and use them as springboards for conversation. So I'm thinking about a book that was very meaningful to me, called David Hanson's The Teacher in the World, where he talks a lot about, different modalities in which we can read our teaching and the collaborative. He talked about this group of teachers who would get together for pizza every Thursday night and just talk about their teaching and how this book could be used. You could spend several sessions on each of the four sections, and just over pizza or over, informal conversation, and having groups of teachers, or maybe over Zoom too, since we have that modality now, really diving into these core questions that the book so powerfully raises.
I think
Yeah.
what Lisa has just said really kind of exemplifies for me how we get wiser about teaching, not just about teaching Israel, but about teaching any kind of teaching. And what I've found really useful is there's a phrase that Diane Tickton-Schuster uses, quoting Rachel Korazim, where Rachel refers to the Israeli. Her job is to invite her students into the Israeli intimate discourse, right? Like how Israelis, the kind of things Israelis talk about or tell each other when diaspora Jews aren't listening. And I felt that many of the chapters in the book were invitations to the intimate educator discourse, right? It was like being invited into the kinds of conversations that, as Lisa said, may happen in the classroom, or the kinds of thoughts that kind of listening into the kinds of thoughts that may only be typically shared in a teacher's personal journal. And that, as I think about how the field moves forward, how we get wiser about the work of Israel education, it really does feel as if it needs to be one teacher at a time, one classroom at a time, and those educators, or the scholars who accompany those educators, really kind of bringing to life these individual cases, because those individual cases are so rich in and of themselves, and I'm declaring my prejudices here, more compelling than statistics about how many teachers are doing this and how many teachers are doing that.
Yeah, I also think, besides the ways in which the book can help individual teachers in varied contexts, I think the book also can be helpful to those people who work with teachers. In Lauren Applebaum's chapter that talks about how do you really help people change their practice? What does it take to promote the kind of transformational learning on the part of teachers that results in not just superficial changes in practice, but significant changes in how teachers think about children, how they talk to them, the kinds of learning opportunities they design. So that a chapter like that can also help those of us who work with teachers think about, what does it take to help somebody get better at teaching? Not just a novice, but an experienced people. How do you support unlearning as well as new learning? And ask what Sivan and Lord call the next step questions. What are the kind of questions that you can frame with and for educators as they think about taking the next steps in their journey of building and developing practice, which I think is another audience for the book and ways in which it can support learning about more effective and powerful and meaningful teaching of Israel. I guess we have to name, I mean, Israel is definitely a hot button topic these days. And I want to name, the elephant in the room is the current situation that we find ourselves in. And you have been, Sivan, it's sort of on the cutting edge of trying to respond to the challenges, the pressing present challenges that teaching Israel is posing to teachers and parents across multiple settings. We know that the book was completed before October 7th, and we know that many educators are seeking help in how to talk about what's happening right now. So how can this book be helpful to people who are currently struggling, even though it's not tackling that as its major focus? I think we need to situate it in our current context. Maybe, Sivan, you're the person to start us off on this topic.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sharon, for this question, because to me, the difference between a question about teaching that might be fleeting and an enduring dilemma of teaching is that in naming an enduring dilemma of teaching, what is kind of in every moment challenging about the work is that the authors in this book who have been able to name really enduring challenges come across in this moment as prescient. Obviously, no one could have predicted the events of October 7th, or at least none of us on this call, or the ensuing war. And also, many of the authors in this volume talk about issues that were important on October 6th and are even more pressing and important in the wake of October 7th. I'll just name a few examples. I have learned tremendously from the chapter written by Sharon Feiman about an investigation of Jewish educators who in one breath claim, I deeply believe that teaching about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a crucial and essential part of Jewish educational work. And also in the next breath say, I actually don't know how to do this in my classroom. And I don't really want to do it, even though I believe it is essential and I believe that I ought to do it. And Karen names what gets in teachers' ways, teachers who deeply believe in this thing that is, again, enduringly important, but even more crucial in this moment, to be able to have meaningful teaching and learning around issues of conflict. And yet that's really, really hard in practice. And sometimes just by naming what's hard about it, we can start to take steps forward in our own practice. I also want to give a shout out to Bethany Horowitz's chapter, because which is focused on gap year education, post high school, pre-college in Israel education. And she names a term called critical inquiry, and the fundamental idea that she was exploring before October 7th, but that I know many, many teachers and their students are thinking deeply about, especially as they think about the ongoing war, is what does it mean to be simultaneously engaged and also skeptical and also critical and also care about continued learning, and being able to hold all of that at once in a classroom, and also to be able to facilitate conversations among young adults in particular with increasingly polarized political positions. This is work that Bethany has been writing and thinking about, and really her chapter gives us some really, really useful language for thinking about what that means in the moment. And I think there are a lot of other chapters in this volume where authors name enduring dilemmas, and in doing so, give us language for talking about what's deeply difficult about this current moment.
Yes, I mean, I think Matt's chapter is another example of a chapter that's really about how to teach emotionally charged issues. That's what he is doing, and he and his students weigh in on that. the challenge of the Supreme Court in relation to the position of the rabbinate in Israel around the issue of who's Jewish. So I think there's a big analogy there. Other thoughts about the ways in which the book responds to the current crisis that we're facing. Yeah, Lisa.
Well, I think Sivan did an excellent job, explaining how the book still is relevant, and all the more so perhaps. But I guess I wanted to highlight, a distinction, particularly in this very fraught time that we're in, and make the case for this book has tremendous integrity, that each of the individual authors have integrity, and the book as a whole has tremendous integrity and is holding that space in a world where often, and one of the constant themes that I saw throughout the book was a notion of the breaking the binary of good and bad, of right and wrong, of left and right, and that really trying to understand in richer, deeper ways all the various experiences of what does it mean to be a teacher, what does it mean to be a learner, how do we teach this very complicated, even breaking the notion of what complexity could mean is raised in some of the chapters, which is really helpful to this moment in time where we are finding so much, that, and our students too, more so, are just bombarded with social media, bombarded with, sorry to use that phrase, but, don't know what to think. And I think holding that space of integrity and creating learning opportunities for critical inquiry, for acknowledging the emotional charges, and for really being honest and courageous about this is so incredibly important right now, because I'm certainly seeing in my own work, a lot of people are feeling very silenced and are afraid to speak. And I think that this book is a way to give voice to a lot of people's questions and concerns.
Something that I'd like to add, and I spend all day at high school talking with teenagers about how they're feeling after October 7th and what their experiences are. And in some ways that has changed my curriculum this year, because I needed to create space to talk about October 7th. But in many ways, I think that October 7th and teaching after October 7th reinforces the importance of learning history from before October 7th. That part of what I'm doing in my teaching is creating space for them to talk about feelings, questions, concerns, but also fielding questions about, well, what's happened in Gaza? Why is Hamas in charge in Gaza? Why did Israel leave Gaza in the early 2000s? Well, how did Israel end up with Gaza in the first place? And this book, I think, has values for being able to answer those questions, or helping to answer those questions of guiding, well, how do we continue to do Israel education? That October 7th has changed Israel education, I believe. It hasn't rewritten Israel education or eliminated the need to continue doing good and effective Israel education. And part of what the volume offers is insights into what good Israel teaching does and what good educators do to make that history meaningful, relevant, come alive. And October 7th has just reinforced how much our students of all ages need to understand the history and what's come before to better understand Israeli society today.
I mean, I'd like to agree with my colleagues about the continued relevance of the book, and I do believe that it continues to be relevant. But I come with a question in that, my sense of the current moment is that someone's turned, the heat has been turned up, right? And I think we can respond as some of you have done, is that yes, the heat is more intense, but it is on a continuum of what we were experiencing previously. What I don't know, and a genuine question, and Matt, in many ways, you're kind of right out there, at the cutting edge is that at what point, when the heat gets turned up, at some point the substance changes form. Ice becomes water, water becomes steam, and we're dealing with something different. And my question really is whether the present moment is now different than it was previously, or whether it's still recognizably what was, and those things that were wise on October the 6th continue to be wise today.
Can you give us some specifics, Alex? Are you thinking of how this is changing the purposes, the way we teach, what we teach, like what's the form is changing? Say a little.
Yeah, I mean, at a point when being identified as a Zionist becomes somehow sinful, right? And when we hear, stories from campus of people being, it's not just cancelled, but friendships broken because individuals identify as Zionists, and it's just not acceptable to be friendly with a Zionist. Now, you could say that was the case previously, but it seems to me there are such profound challenges to how people define themselves today and their relationships to Israel that may well put us in a different place, right? And I don't know. I mean, Sivan, people have been fielding these questions to you, since October the 7th. So I'm not trying to be provocative. Generally not sure how we understand this moment.
I think that's a beautiful, yeah, I think it's a beautiful question, Alex, and we can't know that in this moment. In hindsight, perhaps we will be able to know that. But I do want to build on your changing states metaphor and suggest that perhaps we think about this like plasma, which is at once a solid and a liquid, and that there might be both continuity and rupture in this moment, and that this book will be well positioned to help us think about the continuity piece, and that future research will have to help us understand the rupture, and that those can both be true simultaneously, and that we need a little distance from this moment to be able to do some research, not just be talking heads, but actually do the things that the authors in this book have done, which is seriously investigate their own pedagogical practices in a year or two.
I was actually going to move to a question about the kind of research that we need, both that the moment presses us to undertake, but also that the field, the broader field of teaching Israel that you've in some ways redefined calls for. So what do you see as some of the most pressing questions that need to be asked, or the kind of investigations that you think would be most illuminating and help us sort of build the kind of knowledge that we need? And before people answer that question, that gives you a few seconds to think about it, I want to encourage people who are in our audience to continue to add questions. I have a message from my colleague that we've been addressing, and in particular in the last round, we've been speaking to questions that people have posed already. So don't hesitate to add additional questions that we will get to in a minute. But let's hear your thoughts about the kinds of investigations that would really advance the field of practice and build knowledge about powerful and effective teaching of Israel across these myriad settings. Matt, you looks like you're ready to start us out.
In the conclusion, one of the things that we draw attention to are the sites that are not included in the volume, and we were aware of this up front, and at the same time we were only able to work with what was submitted to us. And I think that also speaks to that there are sites that have not received as much attention. One of the big ones, and I would say this is possibly the biggest, is middle school. There is really not a lot of published data about Israel education in middle school. And this is something that I know that Sivan is actively working on as part of her studies of children and learning about Israel over time. But there are also sites of learning that did not get attention in the book, and that includes camp settings. And I know someone asked in the question section about camps, museums, youth groups, summer camp trips to Israel are some of the many places, and I'm sure there are lots more, rabbinical colleges. We touch on a lot of these places, and at the same time, there are many more that still require our understanding. Not just to say like, oh, we've ticked all of the boxes. Our goal is not to tick off the boxes, but to really understand the ways that teaching and learning are done differently in those spaces. That to teach middle school is different than to teach rabbinical school. The learners in the room have different interests, and the teachers in the room have different interests. And those interests are also different from the camp educators and the people who go on long trips. And so those are some of the places that I am still curious about.
Matt has named the contexts, and I also think that there's some new questions that have arisen post October 7th that we could not have considered before that are really crucial for the investigation of serious scholarly work on teaching and learning. One is a question about trauma tourism, which is this new phenomenon of taking diaspora Jews, but also folks from around the world who are not Jewish, bringing them to Israel. To what extent is this analogous to or not analogous to existing programs like March of the Living? But what does it mean for a teacher and a learner to root learning about Israel in the trauma of October 7th? We don't know about that yet. We need serious investigations. And also, one of the chapters in this book that we haven't mentioned yet is a chapter that I co-authored with my colleague Lauren Applebaum about our professional work with early childhood educators. This year, in the wake of October 7th, we have been doing a lot of professional work with elementary school teachers. And one of the things that we have learned is just incredibly challenging as we learn from children and their educators about this moment, are questions about trauma-informed pedagogy in the classroom, and especially in classrooms where children and their families have both radically different political ideologies and political understandings of the moment, but also radically different exposure to and tolerance for traumatic news. And what does all of that mean for the teaching in a classroom environment where children are in different places on all of these different measures? So important that we learn more about it. We don't know enough about that yet.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, if I can go back to our concept that Lisa previously raised about, we teach who we are. And at the Rosov Consulting team have been studying some of those trips that Sivan has referenced, educators who have come to Israel. We've been interviewing and surveying them after they return home. And something that really strikes me about what they tell us is how they personally have been changed by this experience. They think about themselves as Jewish people and think about their relationship with other Jewish people and with the world beyond differently. But they consistently are struggling with, well, what does that mean for my practice as an educator? So in terms of a research question, it is to try and understand or to try and track the ways in which someone's educational practice, to the extent to which it is changed by, ruptured by, disrupted by profound personal experiences of the kinds that people undergo and have been undergoing in Israel at this moment.
Yeah, these are all wonderful questions. And something else that I brought up briefly a moment ago was, a student right shortly after October 7th, one of my students, a rabbinical student, said she didn't know what to trust. You know, she was reading a lot of material and she really didn't know what was a reliable news source. And I think, you know, in this age of being social media, and there's so much out there that is outside of the classroom, outside of formal or informal context, I really would be interested in learning more about, you know, are there educators who are effectively using social media? How are they using social media? You know, is there a way to help our students be critical readers of material in ways that that they haven't really been taught to do before? And you know, what are the examples where that can is flourishing, or at least is being experimented with? I think that would be really important. And so I'd like to see more research in that area as well.
So people are you're sort of naming some of the new questions and the new contexts that need to be studied. And I also think sort of the need for, this book helps us see the power of scholarship by the people who are doing the work. So I think that's a kind of investigation that we could also profit greatly from, is more research by teachers of Israel about their practice, and to take some of these enduring dilemmas and sort of array a larger sample of people who are exploring or grappling with the same question or the same issue. I'm also really interested in the ways in which efforts to support teachers in learning how to deal with conflict and to teach these very challenging issues, what really makes a difference in people's practice. We know very little about the effects of meaningful professional development and professional learning on what actually happens in the classroom as a result. So I think that's another arena of research that is quite undeveloped so far in Jewish education. Other thoughts about our research agenda? Well, I have a signal from my colleague Jenny Small about a question I think would be a really lovely way to kind of bring this conversation to a close, which is a question about how Israel educators can also bring some sense of hope to learners and to families in this very difficult and fractious and painful time. Thoughts about that, and ways in which perhaps some of the chapters in this book can give us some answers.
I'll start. Sivan started her response at the beginning that teaching is hard. Teaching Israel is really hard. And I think teaching Israel after October 7th is really, really
harder.
One of the things that through my research that I've conducted this year, and I talked to lots and lots and lots of teens in my own school, in my consulting work outside of school, is the importance that kids are finding in their Israel educators, and how that even when their teachers, and I've spoken with them too, are not always sure that they have the right answers, their students are finding tremendous value in what their educators are able to offer. What I would also say as a second thing is that for those in schools, the importance that kids of all ages are finding in community. That community has become this exceptionally important driver, and that so often I hear from kids talking about that they want to leave the bubble. I don't know if that's a Toronto only term. I would imagine it's not. And again, I spend a lot of my time with 11th and 12th graders, and who normally are very excited to leave the bubble. And they've been talking a lot more lately about how beautiful they find the bubble to be. And that there's something comforting in being with community and being able to have these shared experiences with people and valuing the commonalities, and that while they're still excited to go out and explore the world, they're also looking for ways to remain tied and connected to their previous worlds too, in a way that they perhaps hadn't been, I think, before October 7th. And I think that's something important as educators, that we find ways to nurture and continue those connections.
So I want to thank Diane Tichton-Schuster for that question, and also for her beautiful contributions to this work. And I'm about to say two things that are going to be totally contradictory, and I'm going to invite you to hold them both together. One is, I want to express both deep respect and deep skepticism for the stance that we must always find hope and joy. And I know why we want to do that in this moment. It's a really, really hard moment. And one of the things that Lauren Applebaum and I have been learning in our current research project, which is not featured in the book, but stay tuned for future publications, is that as we talk to children about this moment, we hear deeply, deeply tragic stories. And as we talk to educators in this moment, educators are often looking to help their students think about the heroes and the helpers, things that make this moment very much more palatable. And I think I want to invite us all to kind of live with all of that, like the hope that can come from thinking about the actions that people take in the world to make this world better, and also the need to dwell in what is really difficult, very, very tragic about this moment in which we are living. And also, I deeply believe in the transformative power of teachers and teaching. And this book really is an attempt to honor the deep and important work that teachers do. And that is also what gives me hope in this moment, that there are wonderful, talented, reflective, thoughtful teachers who are deeply aware of their own context. And that is a world I do want to live in. And that gives me hope.
Matt said he spends lots of time with teenagers. I spend lots of time with teachers. And I think a source of hope, I think you said, Alex, when we were talking about the book as a resource for teacher learning, that we make changes one teacher at a time. I actually want to challenge that a little bit and say that community, both, not only do teenagers need to feel part of a supportive and shared community, but I think teachers do as well. And the combination of a resource like the book, studied, investigated together in a community of colleagues, can be a source of learning, stretching, growth, and hope as well. So that seems to me an important antidote to a time, especially at this time. Teachers are feeling very beleaguered, as Matt said, and this is a very important time for support and community. I think our time is up, so I want to say much gratitude to Sivan and Matt for making this book happen. And it was a major undertaking and a project that we have this wonderful resource. To Lisa and Alex for your thoughtful questions and comments, for being part of this conversation and helping to unpack what is here for all of us to learn from. To our audience who came to be with us in this conversation with your questions and your interest and open-mindedness. Sivan said, stay tuned. So we want to say, stay tuned to you. This is the last event of the semester for the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. If you missed any of our previous webinars, they're on YouTube and our podcasts. We're working on the lineup for next year, and we'll have that out at the end of the summer. And stay tuned for more wonderful and essential books in our Brandeis Mandel series on Jewish education. Many, many thanks to Sivan and Matt and Alex and Lisa, for Liz in behind the scenes for helping to make this happen, and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thanks so much.